and welcome to the calm, serene interior of a Bentley Flying Spur with a V8 engine, which is significant for a number of reasons. One, chief among which, is the fact that this is the new Flying Spur, which is Bentley's big but not biggest luxury saloon. It's based as the old Flying Spur. It's a third generation Flying Spur. They've all been kind of based off of the Continental GT Coupe. The Conti GT is a cool thing. 2 doors, sometimes no roof, luxury plus 200 miles an hour. That's not something that was always translated brilliantly into a 4-door, because all of that performance remains in, this is a near 200 mile an hour car, but also Bentley is trying to make it luxurious at the same time. And if you're trying to make a car that can do 200 miles an hour in a straight line and also rides imperiously, well, sometimes one of those or the other has to give. And previous Flying Spurs have not necessarily been the last word in comfort, not in quite the way that, say, the Mulsanne, the big Bentley, or something like a Rolls-Royce, which doesn't worry about the top speed so much, has been. But this time things are much different, partly because that's the new platform that underpins the Continental GT, and this coupe is a pretty remarkable piece of kit anyway. Part steel, part aluminium, and the fact that Bentley has been involved in that process from the very start means that it gets certain advantages, because it turns around and says to Porsche, look, we want to make a big saloon car, but we also need the possibility of putting 22-inch wheels underneath it. And it's just involved at an earlier stage, which means it gets to have its input into the process at an earlier stage. And so my understanding basically is that Bentley is, as part of the Volkswagen Group, can turn around and say, look, we are the most luxurious arm of the group. When we're making this platform, it has to underpin a luxury saloon. So let us make one that's got the sort of isolation and refinement that a Bentley really deserves. And I think for the first time, this time around, the Flying Spur absolutely has that. Now, the W12 has already been launched. That has been followed by a V8 version, which tends to be our preferred version of these Bentley cars. The W12 is a cool engine. It's a very compact engine, really short engine, amazing piece of kit, amazing piece of tech. But the V8 is not that much less powerful. It's a bit more efficient, about 15-20% more efficient, and it is also notably lighter and requires less cooling, so therefore not just the engine itself is lighter, but also some of the ancillaries are lighter. And if you're in a car that weighs nearly 2.5 tons, as this does, that sort of stuff matters. So while the W12 has around 600 horsepower, this has 550 metric horsepower, 542 brake, which is plenty to be getting on with, isn't it, really? The Flying Spur W12, we put on a set of scales last year at around 2,500 kilos. This is supposed to be about 100 kilos less than that, so maybe about 2.4 tons, which is still quite a lot, but it is a big car. It's 5.3 metres long, it's 2.2 metres wide to the edge of the mirrors, 2 metres wide across the body. It is a big luxury saloon that sits in a class kind of above most Mercedes S-classes, but below, say, the Rolls-Royce Ghost. Now, that positioning and the fact that it's a Bentley means that while most customers will be involved primarily in the front seats, the fact that it's a luxury saloon means people will occasionally be rear seated. I think most owners drive this themselves, but then they may occasionally get a driver in or something like that to take them to the theatre or the opera or whatever. So current restrictions disallow me from having a chauffeur in the front, but let me just hop in the back and, at least stationary, go through what it's like as a rear seat experience. Okay, so welcome to the rear of the Flying Spur, where, apologies that I can't be moving, but that is the nature of things at the minute. It is a car with plenty of legroom. I'm 5'10", that's my driving position. So sort of an adult behind an adult is absolutely no bother. I've got plenty of legroom. Headroom is not too bad. I've just sort of put this little curtain forwards to give myself a little bit of extra room and to put a bit more light in here. This is not the most airy of luxury car rears. I think if you sit in a Rolls-Royce, you're in a more airy, open experience. This window line is really high, so it feels sort of quite claustrophobic back here. And if you sort of put the put the screens up, close the roof, put the rear screen up, you know, it would feel very private, which maybe is what you like. Or if you wanted a more airy, more relaxed, open interior, then perhaps a Rolls-Royce is for you. There is a touchscreen down here, as with the rest of the interior. Fit and finish is really good everywhere. Fit and finish is lovely, is really lovely all over the place. Things that look like metal, when you touch them, they feel like metal. Yeah, for the most part, anyway. And there's a touchscreen here which can do the climate control, the sort of seat heating and cooling, lighting, ambient lighting, so on and so forth. So it's cool back here. I think, in a way, it's not unlike the front. If you want the full, relaxed, ambient thing, Rolls-Royce is your thing. If you want something a little bit more dynamic in feel, maybe the Bentley is your thing. But anyway, enough of that. Back to the front. However, it is a Bentley, and it's a company that pitches itself as one that makes good cars to drive. Rolls-Royce does as well, to be fair, but Bentley puts a more sporting edge on things, and that is what I quite like about the difference between these two companies these days, is that Rolls-Royce goes full out luxe, doesn't worry about sport, won't even use the word sporting, whereas Bentley is a bit more dynamic and goes, yeah, fine, we're going to make a car that does 200 miles an hour, and yet is also luxurious at the same time. That's the kind of positioning allowed by the fact that they have separate owners these days, and there was a time when Rolls-Royce and Bentley were pretty much as one, as a company. And then Volkswagen, good story this, Volkswagen thought, you know what, we'd like to buy that, when its boss, Ferdinand Piëch at the time, I think, was on a roll to own stuff. So he said, well, let's buy Rolls-Royce and Bentley, and set about doing exactly that. So there was a British company called Vickers, I think, at the time, which made Rolls-Royce and Bentley cars, and it agreed the deal with Volkswagen. And then somebody from a different company somewhere else, I think maybe Rolls-Royce Aero Engines, turned around and sort of read about the news and thought, I'm not totally sure that Rolls-Royce is owned by Vickers as a brand. And it turns out it wasn't. So they sold that bit to BMW, and Volkswagen, thinking it was going to buy Rolls-Royce and Bentley, ended up with just Bentley, while BMW picked up Rolls-Royce. The great thing is, there are now two very, very separate brands doing two very different things, but both making brilliant cars, which still kind of compete with each other. And today's Flying Spur, this one right here, is, I would say, the best four-door Bentley made since that time. I mean, probably ever. Look, I love the big Bentley, the big Mulsanne, and all of the other sort of big cars that have come from it, the coupes and the convertibles and everything else. But they are not a sophisticated piece of kit. They've got brilliant character. They're really lovely. But if you are treating them purely objectively, this is a better car. I mean, I still love the big old beasts. They are brilliant. But this is now a better car than any Flying Spur has been before, because not only is it a car that is quite rewarding and engaging to drive, it is, for me, for the first time, a Flying Spur that really does comfort and luxury really well. It does isolation superbly. It's a bit rainy on the day that I'm recording this piece of camera, which doesn't help from an interior noise point of view, but I have driven it in the dry briefly, and it is really well isolated noise-wise. It also rides, not with the imperiousness and the total isolation of a Rolls-Royce Ghost, but it rides well. It rides really smoothly, really flatly. You can change things down here. It's got its sport, comfort, custom modes, but it's also got this sort of Bentley mode, which looks like a little 8-ball. And to be honest, that's the mode you'd leave it in most of the time. It's the mode that Bentley's engineers set the car up to. If you stick it in comfort, it just gets a little bit too floaty, which actually doesn't necessarily help the comfort. And if you go to sport, it just firms things up maybe a little bit too much, just gets a little bit too brittle. Perhaps on some really smooth German Autobahn or something like that, you would put it in sport for a bit of extra tied downness and stability. But for the most part, Bentley is where you want to be. It steers really smoothly, really crisply, really accurately, and there is active rear steer as well, which is handy because this is a big car, it's a long car, and sometimes active rear steer systems are not completely natural in their feel. You sort of turn and you can feel the car starting to do something. You think that's a bit weird, and then at different speeds it will do slightly different things. This is pretty good. You turn and you just go, oh yeah, well that was a bit more agile than I expected it to be. It's really quite impressive and not weird. That's the main thing. It's not weird in the way it does it. If you want to, you can put the car in full flappy paddle manual mode. This has a twin clutch gearbox rather than a traditional torque converter gearbox. Now, a torque converter would be more refined still, and that was one of the early issues with Continental GT in particular. Was, you know, Bentley is slightly at the mercy of the size of Volkswagen Group. So if Porsche turns around and says, look, we want to use a twin clutch gearbox because that's what suits a Porsche, then, well, Bentley has to slightly suck it up. And it is hard to make a twin clutch gearbox with the same amount of refinement as a fully auto torque converter box. But this is really good. Very occasionally around town, you just occasionally sort of detect the slightest of thunks, but most of the time you won't even recognise it. And if you do want to take control via the paddles, you can. In which case, this engine, I think, sounds nicer than the W12 when you work it up anyway, because it's a V8. W12 is in the UK 170 grand plus, call it 200 by the time you've got some options. This is more like 150. So it is that little bit cheaper, that little bit more efficient. No worse to listen to, I don't think. Better to drive. I think the V8 is the Flying Spur of choice, and now that the Flying Spur is also a terrific, really terrific, big luxury saloon car. Would you have one of these or a Rolls-Royce Ghost? Now, funnily enough, sometimes when we approach one or the other of these companies and we say, can we borrow one of your cars to do a review or a feature or a test? And they say, well, I mean, it depends. What do you want to do with it? Do you want to put it against the other one? And it tends to be Rolls-Royce who are a little bit more hesitant about this because they don't like the straight comparison. This car's better than that car, because they go, well, you know, we think they're just different. I do get that argument. This is a very different car to a Ghost. You could sit and you could make your objective notes all day long, and hey, it's what we do for a living. Ultimately, they do the same job, but in quite different ways. This is a more dynamic, probably a bit louder and slightly less isolated car than a big Rolls-Royce. The Rolls-Royce has imperious isolation, extraordinary noise control. Which of those you prefer basically depends on what you want to do with it, how you want to use it. Now, our road test team put the two on pretty much the same pegging. We've gone to sort of 4.5-star ratings on both of them. It is worth noting that they do two slightly different things. If it were me, I slightly think that the Rolls-Royce does more of what a luxury saloon ought to do. You don't need to do 200 miles an hour. And then freed from that restraint, it's happier to be a more relaxed piece of kit. But I totally understand if somebody who wants to spend a lot of time driving, a lot of time looking maybe a little bit less ostentatious than you do in a Rolls-Royce, if you would opt for this car instead. It's a really good, seriously good luxury car. And the great thing is that Rolls-Royce and Bentley both produce very different cars that do ultimately similar, but two fantastic things.